And we're live with our 97th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Seth Law, at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. It's going to be a fun one today. We are joined by Stefan and Brian. We'll get into introductions shortly. They're both previous guests on the show. And I think everyone's got COVID, whatever hangover. So I'm not sure where we're going to go today, but it's going to be fun. As far as announcements go, we intimated last week that we are going to host a Midsummer Nights Con.
Oh, yeah.
Along with Stefan, who is here today. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That will be on Midsummer's Night. Part of the trick is going to be figuring out what that date actually is. Somebody can look in the Farmer's Almanac or something like that. And that's when we'll host it, is on Midsummer's Night. So we've got some people lined up. Say that again, Stefan.
It's the 24th of June.
Oh, come on. I was going to make them work for it. Damn it. We should talk about these things beforehand. Okay. So it'll be June 24th. Yes. So watch for announcements and for lineup there. We're still solidifying everything, but it will be just short technical talks and all about application security and other stuff. I'm really excited about it. Outside of that, I think we are... Yeah, I don't really have anything else because it's the same day as it was last week when we had this. So outside of Brian and Stefan being here, which is making it special. But Ken, is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
No, I'll just briefly introduce both of these gentlemen, these fine gentlemen. And for those that are new to the show, Stefan and Brian and Seth and I all worked together at one point. Can totally vouch for how awesome they are. I think they've done so much public work that you probably heard, if not heard of them, at least their work. But I'm sure both. Like Stefan has spoken, Brian has spoken at a bunch of conferences, done a lot of work for the community. I think one of my favorite things was Brian working to unscrew the OWASP top 10, the last iteration, with actual facts and data, which I can argue could be made. We need more of that these days. And then Stefan, who, and on Brian's continuing down that path, he's an assistant professor at I can't talk today. Union University. Oh my God. Assistant professor of computer science at Union University. I'm having a stroke today, guys. I apologize.
Community involvement. Like community what? Like,
oh my God.
Wow. Brian,
and
to explain what you do?
Oh my God. This is not going to be a good one, is it? All right, I give up.
This is the second Monday of the week, right?
What day is it? What week is it?
Day but Monday.
We're all Mondays.
Does time even matter anymore?
No.
I mean, really. Oh, so the SAM. Brian also contributed to SAM quite a bit. OWASP SAM project. So when it comes to understanding threat modeling and building risk profiles and things like that, Brian's got a lot of experience. Same with Stefan. He is a practice lead at Trail of Bits. Has done a ton of awesome work. You've probably seen some of his public research around Kubernetes. What was the latest one you had, Stefan? There was something else you did publicly recently.
Yeah, so we've done votes. That's what we talked about partially last time. That was
in Zoom.
Super interesting threat model and security review. Those are both public there. And there's just we at Trail of Bits, we tend to do a lot of core infrastructure, a lot of blockchain stuff, that sort of thing now. So there's definitely a bunch of our publications that are all around Golang and that sort of stuff as well too. So it's an interesting space.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are doing constantly interesting research, and I love the. You can sign up for the Trail of Bits newsletter, which I did. I don't know if the rest, besides Stefan, if the rest of you are following that, but I love those little updates, especially when y'all were working with Zoom, some public info around like engaging with Zoom, and you guys provide that stuff. So it's really fun. Anyway, so point is, 2 awesome gentlemen. And you guys, thank you for joining the podcast. And like, we're going to pick your brain for the next hour. So
sounds great.
Awesome. Seth, did you want to go over, before we get into like threat modeling and all of that, did you want to talk a little bit, you and Stefan, about the Midsummer's Night thing? I don't know if we
Midsummer Night's Con. Yes. Well, I mean, it will be June 24th. We're not quite ready to announce keynotes outside of Stefan. He will be our, initial keynote there. And his talk title was something, again, that I had to Google. So I can't remember it off the top of my head. Right?
The Mortician of Venice.
Yeah, there you go.
No, this started because Ken and I were just riffing on doing a series of talks, and Ken was like, it's fine, but I want you to do a history of software composition. And I've always wanted to have a conference on Midsummer's Night. I think it's a fun little holiday that, you can, it's an interesting holiday, interesting things. I've always wanted to do it. And so when Ken asked me to do it, one of the things that I've always thought about is how Multics did system composition and that sort of stuff. So it went naturally for me to go the Mortician of Venice. So
sweet. It'll be a lot of that, right? Like, so no, it's going to be, I'm excited, right? Like besides your talk, like, the other people that we've got on it, Ken and I'll do, probably, it sounds like we'll fill a half hour with whatever ramblings we decide to, jump on, whether that's secure code review or something else. But we've got others that have already committed, but we're just putting together the lineup now. I mean, basically just watch the space on Twitter, and we'll announce it and get signups and everything going for it. So everyone will get it on their calendar. Just try to host something that's very similar format to this, very low key and useful to people that are in the industry, right?
Yeah, we're trying to get back to like what conferences were before. Like, this isn't a money making. In fact, it's a money losing venture for us. But but we're trying to, like, it's invite only, handpicked talks. Like, it's very artisanally crafted.
Artisanally crafted Midsummer Night's Con.
Yeah, it's very hobbyist. So back to like kind of like the roots of where we started. Less commercialization, less influence, more technical talks.
Yeah, just interesting stuff. Very, very lightweight. No pressure to produce something super flashy or anything, and just people that work in maybe the less sexy portions of the industry, but things that are super important and super interesting, but maybe aren't the ones that will always get the title grabber or always get the talk slot, because it's just not the hotness that everyone wants to hear about. It's not the cool exploit, but it's all interesting stuff and all things that we should be listening to and talking about, but we just don't necessarily. So
Yep. And that, I mean, it almost leads into, sorry, go ahead, Stefan.
I was just going to say very long and drunken absolute AppSec. That's all.
Yes.
Heck yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost a good segue to kind of what we, the reason that we had both of you come on today, right? The overall topic that we wanted to address during this episode of threat modeling. But to your point, Stefan, and to yours, Ken, like I've always felt this like weird, I don't know, dichotomy. I don't know. Like I'm grasping for words here, right? But when you go to information security conferences, like we've got the whole idea of the InfoSec rock stars and the stuff that they produce, the exploits and the bug bounty guys that just get all of the kind of, hey, look how cool this is that I was able to SSRF and take over, like pull someone's AWS keys, and you're like, that's awesome. But on a day-to-day basis, the stuff that we do isn't necessarily like, that's just such a small percentage that it's really hard to get people excited about something like threat modeling, like secure code review, right? It's stuff that's hard. And I think we could do it better and we can make it easier on people. And so, hence the whole reason that we started with Absolute AppSec. But like conferences, I've always felt have a dearth of really good low-level talks like that because everybody wants to go and do, like, they all want to go do SQL injection or whatever else, right? So anyway, that was my rant for the day. I'm done. Ken?
No, I'm glad it's not me. It's just ranty and like out of it.
Again,
so.
it's the COVID hangover, I guess, is what we're gonna refer to it as for the next 6 months, I guess. But let's talk threat modeling, like specifically. Okay, so Brian, like you're quiet. We're gonna talk all over you, I guess, today. I don't know, but
that would be a first.
That never happens.
Yeah, and that never happens. So OWASP SAM, right? Let's talk a bit about the relationship between OWASP SAM and threat modeling. I think we know that they're separate, right? Like from just kind of a strict activity perspective, or like one dovetails into the other. But if you don't mind kind of going into where you see threat modeling fitting into the OWASP SAM process, and we'll start there.
So, SAM being the software assurance maturity model is like by far a superset of a bunch of activities. All the way from governance, where you're looking at policy and such, all the way to operations, where you're looking at patch management environments, that kind of stuff. Threat modeling is absolutely in there. So you have it, it's primarily in the design business function in SAM, in terms of like there's threat assessment, where you're looking at, there's actually a threat model. Security practice in there, or one of the substreams of threat assessment. So, yeah. Threat modeling is actually, it is a relatively important but small subset of SAM overall. But threat modeling's been an interesting animal for years. I got turned down for a job once at a large organization back in the early 2000s for not having formal threat modeling training when it didn't exist.
In the early 2000s.
Threat modeling process for FedEx. So wasn't sure what they had in mind at the time, but threat modeling has been something that's recently, and I'm not entirely sure why, has gotten a decent head of steam.
Mm-hmm. I always go back to kind of the whole assessment process, like, OWASP SAM and, in general, like we're looking at the, software maturity model, or like the system maturity model. But I always go back to kind of that mini risk assessment that Ken and I talk about in the course, as far as you've got to prioritize, right? And you don't know what to prioritize unless you have some sort of a formal methodology that tells you these are the threats, these are the risks associated with my application. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily just what we think of it as coming in there as kind of security practitioners, but what the business threats are that are associated with it. Because if we don't line that up, I know we've all spent time spinning our wheels on portions of applications, on systems that realistically the business could have just turned off with a switch, and it wouldn't have affected anything, right? Well, and that's where I continually go back to is, okay, I'm looking at some like email sign up form or something like that. I'm like, okay, what's the real threat here? Does it make sense for me to spend half of my assessment time looking at some like out of the way form that, really doesn't do anything, as opposed to like the main authentication system, right? And so that's kind of where threat modeling bubbles up. And I think people are starting to recognize that more. But then I'm not sure on like this whole formal methodology for doing threat modeling, right? Because it seems like there's very distinct practices in that area, and one person's threat model is another person's waste of time, and vice versa. Or, hey, all I care about is the number of records that are in this application. It becomes a very kind of subjective thing, and so I think that it's really hard to classify what's going on there and how to actually perform a realistic threat model, right? And threat
modeling is a really interesting animal. So there's a couple of points on it. One, and you've touched on this, this is one of the few times you can actually take people who have the knowledge of security controls and how systems work and actually merge that knowledge with the people who understand the business side of how the app works. There's very few other points in the entire process where those two can actually sit down and get together and figure out, like, what are the legitimate risks to the system. From a security perspective, if we don't understand the business functionality and we don't understand the business risks of a particular system, there's a good chance we'll spend time on things that we don't really need to spend time on, as you mentioned before. But if we don't understand the business, and that's really hard as like that third-party assessor where you get brought in to do a threat model of a system. The hardest part of the whole thing is understanding what the system does, what data flows, what business functionality flows, all of that to try and build this for them. And we're all, again, doing it after the fact. It's fine to do it at that point, but in reality, it needed to be done before the design was ever finished. And that's the part that gets missed a lot. The other part of why threat modeling is so difficult is I used to draw diagrams with like the human side versus the computer side of things. So pre-coding, we have very minimal standards on machine readable stuff. So design documents aren't machine readable. There's very little automation before you get into pre-coding, especially on the design side. It's much more of an art. So it's a lot harder to standardize threat modeling in that respect because it's very much still a human artistic capacity when we look at design. We're getting better when we get into like cloud-based stuff. So we have more standards and structure and guidelines for things. But long before the cloud stuff, everything was so different that you had real trouble getting any structure to it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, we've got that. Stefan, like, I know you're doing assessments of, core systems on the internet, like, realistically, a lot of applications. Like, where does threat modeling fit into your process, right? And like, how is it that you're trying to actually, shimmy that in? I know from a consultant perspective, when I'm looking at mid to large size businesses, like applications, it's very much just kind of willy-nilly. All right, I'm going to do like this kind of mini threat model based on what I know of the application, but it's not this full-on, extensive thing. But I look at like votes, right? I know we had you on to talk about votes and some of the other like real deep dive stuff that you've done at Trail of Bits over the last year, and there's quite a bit of threat modeling that goes into that. So describe your process, like how it is that you sell that you walk into a customer and do that sort of an activity, as opposed to, just rolling it into whatever else.
Was that for me? Or
yeah, that's for you.
All right, I missed like you broke it right there.
4 times.
I also think
crap.
There's a few different things. There's a few different things that go on for sales and whatnot. Like we do have a lot of customers just coming in asking for threat models, right? People want to understand their design. They want to have someone do the sorts of things that Brian and I do. I think the other thing is that we run into many folks who are maybe a little earlier in the process for things. They maybe shouldn't have a full code review. They maybe shouldn't have someone like really deep dive into things when they can throw everything out right now. But the design is going to last longer there. And I think the issue that we see very frequently is that selling threat models is actually relatively easy. It's consuming the outputs from them and actually making sure that they're an impactful change is an important thing. It also harkens back to what you said earlier about like, is threat modeling a formal process? A friend of mine, Logan, runs Rogue Dynamics, and they have a podcast called Tear Lines. And I was talking with him because he mentioned threat modeling, threat assessment, that sort of thing. And it spurred an interesting thought. Like, we don't actually have a maturity model for threat modeling. Like, there is a non-formal threat modeling process. Like, it's kind of asking what's the worst that can happen with any feature, Like devs can do that. They don't need anything super formal. And you can do rapid risk assessments internally. Like, what's the confidentiality impact for this? or you can do Stride or those sorts of things. Like you can progress up the chain. So I don't think selling threat modeling is difficult. It's figuring out where it fits into your processes, which parts are self-serve, which parts are serviced by external vendors, that sort of thing. There's different levels that you can do. I don't think it has to be, it's a formal process that only a select few do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes to your point about it depends on what the desired outcome of the threat model is, right? So like, Ken, I know looking at code, when you're given a new feature, that's one of the things that we always talk about is, hey, get a couple people's eyes on it to basically say, what's the worst that can happen? The dev will tell you, but also like the security guys will have some ideas, but everybody's view is different. And being able to take that and say, all right, this drives exactly what we're looking at from a code review perspective is different than, all right, this is going to be pushed into the cloud or whatever else, right? Like, so yeah. So that to your point, right? It's different based on what the desired outcome is. Okay, so to go back a little bit, just so we've got like people understand exactly what it is if they're listening to this for the first time. Stefan, you mentioned Stride, you mentioned Dread. Do you want to explain what those are really quick before we just short like primers on it? Rapid risk assessment.
No,
let's define some terms. No. Google. Go Google those terms.
Google everything I say. No. So Stride is basically a series of. They're not really.
Oh wait. Maybe we should ask the professor. Sorry.
Yeah, ask Brian. Brian cool. He's going to look it up. He's Googling.
Right. I'm helping. Decisive steps in a specified direction.
No, but
that's what you meant, right?
I think for me the progression is like like a level 0. If you're looking at it something similar to a Hunt maturity model for threat modeling, you'd have level 0. It's like no or minimal threat modeling. Maybe level 1 is kind of like, oh, we had a previous security issue, and we want to make sure it doesn't exist. So how do we what controls do we have in place to make sure that doesn't exist? And when I say control, I mean like a safeguard, a checkpoint, something like that, some CNSSI style like definition of control. And then level 2 is what I'm thinking here is like Stride, those sorts of things. Stride is like what? Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, integrity, blah, 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 blah. But basically, it's a series of things like what happens if someone spoofs this? What happens if someone tampers with it? What happens if they replay it? Whatever it is. And as you go through, you ask a series of questions, you talk about those sorts of things. Brian and I obviously do a different type of threat modeling very frequently, very control focused, very like asking questions about data integrity. I tend towards NIST 800-154. But how long into this were we? We made 29 minutes apparently. Before I mentioned
before NIST.
Oh my gosh!
I wondered.
Yeah,
Ken owes me $20 now.
Exactly. But like, Stride is good if you want to have a simple set of questions that you can ask. I had a client recently that I used includes no dirt, which is a healthcare specific threat modeling process. So you can go through and ask them about repudiation as well as non-repudiation and data integrity and those sorts of things there. So it's basically a series of questions, a series of thoughts, prompts really. Obviously, it's a little more technical than that, but it's basically a way of framing certain attacks and then trying to describe what the system either does with those attacks or something that prevents those attacks from happening, if that makes sense. It's an attack-focused vector. So,
okay.
Ryan, do you have different thoughts on it?
No, I mean, that's pretty much, Stride came out of Microsoft's work for trying to figure out how to improve their security. Same with the Microsoft threat modeling tool. And for some people, Stride is just right. And for some people, Stride's still heavy. The thing that is good to remember is Stride and threat modeling tool came out of an OS level threat modeling. Mm-hmm. So sometimes for some people, it's a little bit more difficult to get those to work for like web apps or serverless or something like that, because that's not what they were originally designed around. We also mentioned Dread. Dread is interesting. I've still seen a few people still use Dread, even though Microsoft tried to make it disappear quietly over 10 years ago, because they found that they just got too many inconsistent results with Dread that they tried replacing it with Stride, but the internet has not let it die.
In fact, people combine them. They say Stride/Dread. So it's very common to see the two of them lumped together as if they're just one thing, when they're really actually not only different, but they were like one was meant to replace the other.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I'm trying to think of all the threat models that I've done. It's been a few years since I've been really involved in like a huge threat modeling project, right, for an organization, right, embedded in it on a team that's building out, a series of questions and trying to classify all of their different products against, a specific methodology in order to classify, okay, we know that this is the highest priority or the highest risk severity application that we own. So we need to classify all of like most or more work towards that application versus the other ones. And I think that's where people struggle. So, I mean, Ken, I know you're at, GitHub/Microsoft/ the Borg right now. So tell me a little bit about what you're like. I mean, do you get involved in the threat models over there? How extensive are they? Or is it just like the mini ones that we've talked about from a code review perspective?
More, I can answer the last question the easiest. That's more the latter. It's more like not a full-on threat model. In fact, we're just now building out checklist. I just contributed last week to a checklist of like just basic questions that, and by the way, Stefan, I'm going to put Ken Toller's question up here.
I'm answering him too.
Awesome. So anyways, mini risk assessments for like code review. And then like, because Brian mentioned pretty early on in this podcast that, he's seen sort of a resurgence where people are caring about this now. I anecdotally, just from like the couple other companies that I've talked to that are similar to GitHub, and our situation is the same, which is we have like more people are breaking out of it's not just about breaking out of the monolith, but it is about like there being new apps instead of just new features in a monolith that get added to pretty frequently. So like basically like less additions to the monolith and more of that work going out to like a Golang app or a Node app or something that isn't like, I see somebody in the background, a Ruby monolith. Yeah, for those listening and can't see, that was a cool little, I love it. Max, my son does it to me too. He comes in all the time. Where's it going with that? Anyways, just like, because of these new apps coming online, we have to figure out pretty quickly, like, what do we care about? Because I can't do a line-by-line code review of every app. Mm-hmm. So in order to focus on the important bits and also just think about giving it advice before we even start building the app, which is another thing you said, Brian, which was ideally this isn't done after things are developed, and I think that's really where I'm seeing a resurgence on our side, which is new stuff's going to get developed. We're now luckily in a position, we've set ourselves up as a team to get brought into the mix right away before stuff gets developed. And, again, like, I don't want to go too lengthy into this, but we, instead of having AppSec be like, come to us when you're developing a new app, what we did was say, hey, let's open up a generic security review so that all of our departments, GRC, CERT, SecOps, whoever has input into like this new thing you're going to build, including AppSec, and all of us have to do our reviews. And so that's gotten that in front of us quicker. But again, because of the pace of development and the team size, even though it's a pretty big AppSec team, we have to just focus on like what bits matter the most. And that's where this comes into play for us. Long-winded answer, but that's why.
Okay.
It's interesting how the process has changed. When we used to do waterfall development, you spent months in design, and that facilitated having a security person show up and be like, all right, let's walk through this. And you could take your time and you could hammer things out because you had time. and it was designed that way. And now we've changed to, we almost don't have design anymore. There's a lot of times where they'll go down to an agile model to the level I've had developers be like, what's design? We don't design. And so like you have threat models play different roles depending on when they are in the process and to what level you go to. I've helped companies build a threat model process for agile where they went into every time we create a user story, let's change it up a little bit to say where only the right people can access this, or I can only see my own reports, or just a little bit of a tweak to the language to try and imply that you have to have some kind of security control in place to make sure that the feature doesn't get abused. There's definite benefits for that. The problem is, from my perspective, your trade-off is you don't have an overall understanding of the system. You get a lot of tiny points in time for tiny little pieces of functionality, but you don't have the overall understanding of risks of the system, much less even larger beyond that of that system with other systems it touches. So it's not like you can't do that kind of threat modeling in no other type. And I've run into that where I get concerned because people have tiny insulated perspectives of little threat models for individual functions, but they don't understand. They lose out on these can be chained together thing.
Yeah, so that's certainly been a functionality. Like when new features get added, I have seen that where it's like, especially with our specific authorization case being so complicated that it's easy to, and we've tried to build as many checklists as we can, like that, for instance, your controller has to inherit from one of these controllers, and that if you're creating an API endpoint, here's all the things we in AppSec have to check for. We try to make that somewhat transparent, but honestly, it's more useful if that's in the developers' minds these days. At that point, we're kind of like almost like mechanics, just checking each one of the things on our items or on one of the items on our checklist, and trying to give the developers a real sense of what they should be caring about. It's a weird situation just because, like, again, it's the pace of development, and it's needing the developers to kind of be like aware and cognizant of, like you said, the interconnected bits there, especially when it comes to authorization, which is super fucking hard in our specific situation. So
it has to be more explicit now. You cursed. I was trying not to curse.
Yeah.
And I've been doing so well, and then you fucking.
I know. I'm the worst.
Now I really, I do think it's specification versus discovery. Like I said in our private comments here, like, Dan and I have Dan Guido at Trail of Bits and I have a talk on like what blockchain gets right, and there's not a lot. I don't want it to sound like there's a Panache over here or it's utopian. Like there's a lot of bad stuff. I said stuff, not shit. There's a lot of bad stuff in blockchain.
You said both. Yeah.
But I do think one of the things that blockchain gets right is they understand that specification is required very frequently, even if it's just an API designed by contracts, that sort of thing, or they go through and do like full Verix or K Labs or any of that sort of stuff specification. I think a lot of times, and this is that whole like left or right of boom sort of where do you do this thing, but I do think the earlier you can move it, the less problems you'll have later, of course. And like formal specification or even semi-formal specification helps with that sort of stuff, but that's a lot of work, and no one wants to do that.
Well, and I would almost argue to Brian's point about waterfall versus agile, that like we don't build requirements really anymore, right? Like we don't actually go and architect out a system very well, like I saw 15 years ago when I'd walk into an organization and they would have all of these documents about this is how we're going to build this application. These are the frameworks that we're going to target. This is, these are the problems we're trying to solve. Nowadays it's, hey, it's agile. So just go build a UI and then we'll figure it out as we go, because the whole MVP style thing, which, we do get software quicker, but on the flip side, like we don't have a lot of thought that goes into it before we've got a product, like realistically. And so like it's almost like we're just missing the whole like formal structure around it. And so we're designing threat modeling in these kind of use cases. Like you're talking about evil user stories. Yeah. Stefan, you brought that up, right? Like that's definitely what Brian's suggesting as well. But I know when I get in and I start talking to architects of systems, like at big companies, right? It's very much okay, have you even thought about like AAA and CIA? I'm like, let's leave Stride aside. Let's actually talk about core information security, like pillars that are out there. And if you haven't thought about authentication, guess what? Like we're going to have to go back to the drawing board on a lot of this because it's, we're going to have to shim it in. And so like, I almost fall back to those when I'm doing a threat, model or a threat assessment nowadays, as opposed to using something like Stride, because they've never heard the term auditing before, right? Like in terms of logging, right? I'm like, no, you really have to log everything, right? Like I have to know what your user did in order to tell people that, or have any sort of assurance that you have non-repudiation and all the other things that go into it. And so like that's where I've seen the industry kind of move, is they're trying to shoehorn threat modeling into Agile, and it's not working super well. And maybe that's the backlash that we're having.
I mean, I could tell you my specific case is similar to what you're saying, trying to like mold the two or merge the two together so that so for instance, I have like this list of new application requirements. And those are things that everybody's supposed to kind of walk through. And the idea is hopefully eventually it becomes very much like Listo, where, like a project board card gets created if you say I do authorization. And like, I don't know, I don't have like unit tests, for instance, like for negative test cases. Well, a project card could be created and a task issued out saying that, before this goes live or at some point soon, we need those tests. So that's one thing. But then like the idea is from that too, we get a picture, hopefully, of like what security controls haven't been implemented, those that have been implemented, and a little bit about what the system's doing. But that's not where it ends, because it has to be like also in tandem with that, a sort of kickoff call about what you're building. And ideally that has more than just, like I said, the AppSec team, and we can all get kind of an idea of that's like the utopian dream, basically, is like, mine anyways, is to be able to just be like, all right, here's a list of requirements, things you need to know up front, what you're going to need to do with building your app. Let's walk through your architecture docs and answer any questions you have, and then we'll ask our questions. Like that's sort of where we're going. I don't know. This is again, going back to what Brian said, he was like, I think you kind of intimated that like there is maybe misunderstandings around what a threat model is. And then like I'm sure Stefan, you come across this in consulting, and Seth, you too. I'm sure you like get called in. Hey, we want a threat model. And then you get in there, you're like, no, that's not what this isn't a threat model. Like that's not what you really, yeah, exactly. So I'm not sure how often that happens to you all, but I am curious. I'm sure the people listening are curious.
I think the difference is that like what Brian and I end up doing in threat models very often is probably a few different processes that clients very often should be doing themselves. So for example, one of the things Brian and I always ask is, do you have a data classification matrix? Do you understand what every single component in your system actually does? Do you have a process for assessing the risk of every single system, from business impact analysis to change in security impact level, whatever it is? Like all the various processes, we group them together in threat modeling because it's easier to describe to clients and say, we're only doing one process and we're going to give you one report. But in reality, we're doing several different things that an information security officer or an information security function within a system, within an organization should probably be doing. So it's like risk analysis, risk acceptance, awareness training, like tabletop exercises or those sorts of things. Like we do all of these things during our threat models, or we try to cover as many of those as we possibly humanly can during our threat models. And then we end up with one report that we try to lump everything together, and it's usually huge. And you can see that there's two public ones that we've done at Trail of Bits, the Kubernetes one and the votes one. And they're rather large, dense documents. And if you look at the votes one, there's one finding that has like 6 or 7 recommendations associated with it, because I didn't want to write up 6 findings. It was easier to just say your processes need to be reviewed, right? So I think what we lump as threat models is mostly because consulting is hard, and it's hard to tell people that we're going to do like 70 different things that you actually should be doing as an ISF but aren't.
Yeah.
So,
the way we do threat models is comprehensive to the level that I could almost fill out a SAM worksheet from them.
Yeah.
By the time we're done, because we'll get into the, hey, how do you manage an incident response? We don't get deep into it. We just say, do you have something to help manage that? Do you have something that sets baselines for any of the machines or the pods or the whatever you're using in your architecture? Do you know what it is before you deploy it? And then do you know what it is after you deployed it? Because the app has to run on trusted setup. So do that. And then like Stefan mentioned, we've got talk about like, do your developers know what they're doing? Are they given any guidance? Are they given any help? Do you have guidelines for them? Do they have Bastion host access, or is this all on a flat network with a single VLAN and everybody and their dog has an account and we don't track anything? All of that all matters in terms of the security of an application. It's not purely just the code that's written.
Oh, it's absolutely not. It's also like the code or the, I don't know if it's, we classify it as code that like spins up the, like you said, the infrastructure bits. Like just this morning, I was reviewing some Terraform configs because out of an AppSec review, the first part of a review is what we just talked about, which is like the threat modeling, discovery. Well, the bits that kind of resemble threat modeling, like discovery and all that stuff. And anyways, like that was a part of it, was we wrote up individual findings like, hey, this individual AWS component needs XYZ. And so, we got tagged on, okay, here's the fix for it, Terraform configs. And that's where it's come. Like when I started at GitHub, we primarily just did code reviews and that's it. But as we've just like expanded technology wise, and our team has grown, out of necessity, we've had to review everything it connects to, including the infrastructure, like if it's using something in AWS or Azure or whatever. So we actually have a new team member on the team whose specialty is Azure, who came over from Microsoft. So yeah, it's super important to us. It's a change from like 2.5 years ago when I started.
Well, and there's a place for like the stuff that Stefan and I do is, it's not you would never do it to every system. No. You wouldn't do it to every, it's for the high risk. It's for the people that need a higher level of assurance of what they're working on within their system. This is not something like I'd write up as a process and hand it to an organization and say, do this on every app you have.
See, but we've all been at those organizations where it becomes mandated, right? Like, oh, we're doing a risk or we're doing a threat model, right? Like, and this is the other thing is people have a hard time between threat modeling and risk assessment. That, Stefan, to your point, right? Mm-hmm. So everything gets rolled under threat modeling, but the rapid risk assessment from Mozilla here is a great resource to actually like help you classify that. Because I don't know, like I go back to my time at the bank when they were just figuring out like security. The security team was new. They're like, oh, we're going to test all of our applications every single year. And I'm like, okay, this is the 3rd year that we've looked at a mortgage calculator online that runs in JavaScript and somebody spent like 40 hours. I'm like, why are we doing this, right? Like, because there was no like profile up front as far as what's the risk to the organization. Oh, well, there isn't any, right? But no one had ever made that call. And so we had to go build out our own process. What?
How many times in our course that we give about teaching people a source code review, and do we get the people that are like, wait, how are we supposed to do this methodology? We've got like 2 or 3 people, and we have about 3. I mean, literally, this is the number that someone dropped to me was 3,000 applications and 2 people actually reviewing, and them as the manager. Yeah. What the fuck are you doing? Like, no, like what? I said, I was more polite, obviously, but I was like, and it wasn't at them. It was about the organization. I'm like, what? I said, what's the prior? We had asked them before, like, what's the prioritization that you guys use on like what apps she'll assess? And they're just like, well, the business says everything's important. I was like,
that means nothing is.
Maybe we should just put this course aside for a second and let's just address this head on.
We'll have a course on all the, Brian used to call it eating your InfoSec vegetables. I know that title has been used by other folks. But I would love to teach like a 1-day crash course on like these are all the policies that you should have. One of the things that I do very frequently at Trail of Bits is just walk blockchain companies through. These are all the policies that you should be following, even if it's NYCRR 500 or something very lightweight. These are the things you should be doing. And yes, it includes like, when do I alert someone? Like you have to know this. You're going to run into it, so you might as well do it now,
like the basic thing, like hygiene and things you should have in place. And I'm not crapping on anyone. I'm just saying, if you don't prioritize, like, you can't be effective at your job. I don't understand how. It's just to what Seth said. It's just, if you're like reviewing the same JavaScript thing that someone kind of half-assed put together a while ago, and like now they're, for some reason now it's in scope every year for some third party. Yeah, like you're doing your program injustice and spending your money and resource and in a place that doesn't make any sense. And so it's do the risk assessment.
It's business risk versus system risk, right? If it's, the example I always use is one that Brian and I actually ran into. We had 2 systems. They both had XSS. One was like a kiosk in the lunchroom that was like, it wasn't even attached to the network. It was literally never updated. And they would update it by SneakerNet. So someone would come over and like bring a USB thumb drive or something where they take it out. And then there was one that's like public facing website, and it's obvious after the fact, but if you're just looking at there's 2 XSS and you have no context around where they exist, what they do, etc., it's very difficult to say I should fix this one versus that one, because the lunch menu one might actually look really bad in situ until you realize that like you can't actually affect this vulnerability because who you're going to XSS yourself. Like, there's literally no way that you can do a transitive network attack there, so understanding that is important. And I wrote NIST 830 style split in the chat here, but it's true. You need that sort of dichotomy between a system risk and a business risk and understand those 2.
Yeah.
One question.
I don't know. I feel like you're asking a lot, and Brian, at least you're like teaching people about this, right? But like, I don't know. I mean, okay, on the bug bounty side as well, right? Like, how many times do we see stuff come in from security people, and it's always justifying, like, oh, this is critical risk. This is critical risk. I'm like, dude, it's XSS and a mortgage calculator. No one, you know what I mean? And it like only reflects on. Like, honestly, take a chill pill. This could be a low risk, right? Just because it's XSS and everybody's talked about it for years. Again, that's what we run into in the space. And I've seen multiple reports from, people that I've worked with in the past, people that like other organizations that they like, there's no, okay, so we're getting away from threat modeling, but there's no standard on what the risk of any of this is, right? You can go to CWE, you can go, you can go rate it in CVSS, but everybody does it differently. And so that's the hardest thing about like being a security professional in my view is actually giving things risk that is relevant to the business. And that's where we provide our value. And yet I see it screwed up so often. I don't know how to teach people or give people the ability to actually take that into account and really work it through, because they just want to assign it with a label and move on. So I mean,
trying to take something that's mostly subjective and make it objective. And
Well, you can't.
Not easy.
I don't think this is the common complaint about CVSS, right? It's because if you watch Full Disclosure or you look at NVD or anything, or you look at someone's resume even, and this is not a knock against people who hunt for CVEs, but you very often see something that's like a CVSS of 10 or it's like an 8 or something very high, and you look at it and you're like, I've never heard of this software. I don't think I understand what they're trying to relay. But it's very different it's very difficult to contextualize that risk for something that should I worry about this? Where does this thing actually exist? And we at our last company that we all worked at together, we constantly had discussions about what does adjacent mean? What does network mean? Is this actually affected by a network position versus an adjacent position? And that sort of discussion is good. However, in without context, you can't just say unless you're so specific of this exists on this server with these specifications and you make it actually objective because you relay all the contextual information, it's just everything I don't like is escalation of privilege.
Yeah. Well, and I mean that one, I don't know, when I get bored, which is not very often, but I love looking at the CVSS scores and how they're generated, because every single time I disagree, right? I'm no, you're full of shit, right?
You agree?
No, not yours. I agree with yours, of course. But the majority of those CVEs that come out, I'm okay, you found one instance at one company, and I'm no, that does not equate to a 9. I'm sorry, right? This is custom software somewhere. It very rarely is it above. For the organization itself, maybe it's an 8, but for the internet at large, that CVE is a 4 or a 2, and that's the whole contextual is what we're missing, which goes back to the threat modeling that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So how do you teach people, or how do you actually convey that to people that are making those classifications? I'm looking at Brian specifically because he's, supposedly molding our youth at this point. But how is it that you bring this into relevance for students?
I mean, a big part of it is making sure that, for humans, we can understand context. It's a mindset. It's really being open to thinking through those things. We have a tendency, especially in development, that we simply think through, this is the positive path. I have a goal. I have a target. I need to make sure something works. And it's hard enough, and especially in today's technology stacks, just to get the dang thing to work once. And it's not you don't want to introduce a bunch of variability where you're well, what if I messed with it? And the default's and I've got students that are I don't want to touch it again because it worked once. And I'm afraid it won't work again. And it works here, but if I check it out of GitHub over on this other machine, it doesn't work, and I don't know why, and it stresses me out. And I was welcome to being a developer. This is the next 10 years of your life if you choose this path. But it's really just having enough knowledge and enough mindset to think through things in an other than purely happy butterflies, rainbows path of, I have this goal to achieve and I've achieved it and I'm done. Yeah. Because I loved it back in the day when I was getting into more testing, we get into capability testing, which was different than purely functional testing or non-functional testing. Because capability wasn't just, does this do what I want it to do? But what else does this code actually do? And that's usually when somebody manages to find a vulnerability, is because they've actually found capabilities that your code has that you never really intended for anybody to use for another purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, you're getting into fuzzing and full test suites, and yeah.
And we've known about these for 15, 20 years, and we're still barely scratching the surface of them.
Well, yeah, it's all Agile's fault, right? Because we have no actual.
I have a love-hate relationship with Agile. I've tried to get back in the coding in that environment, and I can't stand it.
So I was an Agile dev. I think, and Trail of Bits uses Agile. I think that the difference that we have, though, is that I have a product manager. He collects specifications as part of an inception. He goes through and does he basically, his name's Matt Reinhardt. He's he goes through and does all those sorts of things. He gathers client expectations, client requirements, and everything, and then we do tasking and stories out of those sorts of things. And I think that's the thing that's so frequently missing, is that there's no, I hate to say it this way, there's no adult in the room putting together a process and making sure that the inmates aren't running the asylum, and agile is fine if you're a small team and you're kind of, it's a more fertile, like fecund area that you're trying to grow, right? You're working on something new or whatever. But if you're a mature organization, you do need a product manager who's going to gather specifications and processes and help translate those into stories and tasks and that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's just it's unrealistic to think that you can just tell people, like, make me an app that does X and they're going to come up with X, when in fact you meant that also includes all the letters before X, because those are obvious things to you, but it's not obvious to someone who isn't maybe a subject matter expert, Yeah. So.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I still go back to the, how do we help others get to the point that they're doing that they're doing service to threat modeling, to risk assessment. I know we have that classification that's in OWASP SAM as far as okay, this is where your threat modeling is, right? But how do you share that with someone outside of just giving them documentation and letting them run with it, right? How do you teach that? I don't know. How do you teach context, Brian? Come on, give me an easy answer.
I mean, and the other problem we run into is we don't scale well, because most of threat modeling still at this point is still very human-driven behavior.
Oh my gosh, it's brutal. 100-page documents.
Well, yeah, I mean, if our template's 60 pages long.
Our current template at Trail of Bits is 65 pages long.
Oh, jeez.
Sad in its own respect. People don't like super long documents like that.
No.
I don't blame them. That's part of the reason why, Seth, I think threat modeling's really, really struggled to take hold as a first-class citizen in security processes, is because it is not something that you can say, hey, here's a 5 bullet point checklist. You're now a threat modeling expert. Go at it.
Yeah.
And because, I mean, there's stuff that the reason why Stefan and I threat model well together is we have a fairly diverse background.
We're very different
between each other. Yeah. But our wavelengths align, but they're quite different. So I'll find stuff that he hadn't thought of, and he'll find stuff that I would have never have dreamed of. But it's purely based on both of our 15, 20 years of experience in different technologies and frameworks and jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tough to do within an environment
So are you saying that basically until someone has experience, there's no hope?
No, I'm just saying that you're not going to find certain things. I mean, there's a base level of stuff that you can say hey, make sure there's some core things. Are you logging this here? How would you know somebody messed with this? Stop making assumptions and keep asking the questions until you can get down to that nitty-gritty answer. Because we'll find a lot of times that it's just oh, we'll know if somebody messes with something, and nobody asks how. How would you know if somebody was in there messing with those values or those attributes? How do you know they're the same as what you intended to write to the database?
This also, though, there's the opposite side of this, is when you're doing risk assessment processes, what is the likelihood of occurrence versus the likelihood of discovery versus the likelihood of exploitation? And that's the other set of weeds that people don't like to get into. Brian and I...
It's subjective. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and we make a super general likelihood. We just call it likelihood because it's really complex to legitimately think through all of the details.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. And I get the rapid risk assessment approach that Mozilla is coming out with, because they're trying to at least give people something that they can wrap their heads around quickly, right? And I mean, we try to do the same thing in the course, is like, all right, at the very least, like, think about what can go wrong, right? It doesn't have to be everything, but at the very least, talk to the developers, talk to the business, and say, what's the worst thing that can happen with this application? And if that's like, okay, 1% of the 1% of their user base gets a pop-up, guess what? That's probably not a huge thing. You lose hundreds of millions of dollars. All right, that's where you should focus your effort, right? And so, like, I get that portion, but like, I still struggle with those, like, context and teaching people, like, to really think through likelihood, exploitation, like where something sits. Like, it sounds very easy to us that have been in the industry for a while and seen lots of applications, but to a new employee that, this is their first job in security, they walked into the security team, and you're like, hey, well, threat modeling is pretty easy. Here's, Microsoft threat modeling tool, go threat model this application. Like, that just has failure to me written all over it, because they don't have that experience. Yeah. And so, like, where do you give them that experience? How do you get them up to speed on that in a less than 20-year career? I don't know how that's possible. So teach me, Brian, Stefan.
It's similar to testing, right? Like, imagine having a fully fledged application and then coming back and being like, hey, newbie, go write some unit tests for this, because we didn't write unit tests. But everyone at the company knows how this is supposed to work, so don't worry, it's fine. But go write some unit tests. Like, I think we've all been there with applications.
Yeah. No. That's what we do to interns, though, right? Like,
that's why they hate like, but I'm not advocating for test-driven development. I think that's its own special case of hell and torture. But I am saying that some level of specificity up front and some level of understanding of design intent, whether that's designed by contract, actual specifications, having someone like, a product manager on your team collecting requirements, any of those sorts of things, you need those up front. It's just, otherwise you're trying to play catch up after the fact, and it's just incredibly painful.
Yeah, I think the more I see threat modeling, the more I see, the more I think about it, the more I think it's like anything, right? Like, we always talk about pushing left, even though I kind of hate the term now, but like that's what we have to do with it. If it's not happening around the same time as we're doing the architecture of an application, we're going to miss stuff. It's too late. It's just like, the assessment work that we do, like, if we're assessing code, we're building unit tests, we do it after the fact, we're going to miss stuff. It's just that is the reality that we live in. And so, I don't know, like, I still encourage people to do it, right? Like, it still makes sense to go and risk assess something, especially from a business perspective, after the fact, if that's the last place that you can do it. But I know I'm going to miss stuff, and I know that, like, we're not going to have a big enough team. The person that designed it or chose that framework didn't necessarily think about all the risks that go into it, and all of a sudden you have ASN.1, issues with the library. Like, that kind of stuff all falls into place, right? So
I think it's holistic. It's like when clients ask me if they should fuzz or they should do unit tests. And it's like, well, those aren't mutually exclusive. Like, unit tests are attempting to show some sort of design intent. We expect it to do X, Y, and Z. Whereas fuzzing is supposed to discover the edges you didn't necessarily think of. And I'm saying fuzzing, but symbolic execution can be used here, abstract interpretation, property testing, which is kind of the love child of fuzzing and unit testing. But there's all sorts of things there that you can do. I'm probably lagging at the moment, aren't I? But
no, you're fine.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, there's several different things that you should do, and it's a holistic process. It's not like, we did risk assessment, now we're done. Like, no, there's a whole level of, like, I can risk assess one app. Like, I can find XSS in the mortgage calculator, let's say, but like, that's not interesting. You see it in the chat on Absolute AppSec. I have XSS in there, but what else can I do? Maybe the mortgage calculator is loaded into a larger website, and now I can suddenly add myself to your mortgage and then take out a line of equity. That's what's interesting. The XSS itself is uncontextualized, is bullshit. I can now because Ken did. But but the actual contextualized risk is what's actually interesting. Also, Brian, I am so sorry because you're not using earpods and your kids are home. But anyway,
I can't hear you.
But anyway, it's the contextualized risk. XSS in mortgage calculator, who cares? XSS on a larger banking application where everything is JavaScript and I can maybe call a function to do something interesting. That's cool. That's where it becomes interesting. The cyber physical kill chain, if you want to use a bunch of buzzwords, is the cool part.
But okay, so and that goes back to like this whole overall process that we have of assessing our applications, right? It's very rare that I've run into an organization that runs more than one threat model on an application, right? Even if they do it on a yearly basis, it's like, oh, well, we did that last year. Here are the answers to that question, and then they move on, not taking into account that, hey, the environment changed or some of the other things. And so unless you've got some sort of a process to capture that on the back end, like you're testing, you could struggle with what the actual threat to that application is.
I think Brian and I have worked at 2 organizations together that did it well. One was a government organization, and they obviously had like a group of, I'm sorry?
Time out. A government, you just used a government organization as like a good example of something?
Yeah. I think government has good processes at times. They might be, say what you will, but at times government can have very good processes. They also can have the no, you can't move your desk. That's someone else's function. I got written up for that too. So
Blink twice if the government's making you say this, Stefan.
I'm not under duress. I don't know what you're talking about. But no, but they had a good process for like business impact analysis, change, that. And then the other was a large hedge fund that Brian and I worked at. They had but they literally had a whole group that was separate from GRC, that was separate from risk analysis or like assessments and everything. And they literally sat there and all they did was business impact analysis and change in security impact level. And that's all they did. Literally all they did all day. And they were great at it. But those are that's the level of investment that you have to make.
Mm-hmm.
Which is hard, and not everyone can do it.
Yeah.
I love how Seth is like,
Seth's like, you're digging this hole deeper. I was trying to climb out of it.
Man, you just turned me into a nihilist further every time you come on the show, Stefan.
Security nihilism.
Well, so about the XSS that they're talking about in Slack, where it's like XSS isn't that's the whole other argument for a different day, which I love that we're having it about XSS in many contexts is not that big of a deal, but just an example of the whole risk assessment / threat model, however you want to look at it, and the early on in the development. I mean, one thing that's interesting on that note is, for one, if you're doing it upfront, it's very easy to say use a CSP, use a paved path for a templating language, something like that, or things like that to sort of reduce the likelihood of XSS being introduced or lessen the impact if it is introduced. But later on in the this, if it had already been developed and we tried to go back later, one thing we're seeing internally is that we've actually had to go and say, okay, this is your design plan starting from the beginning, and here's how the latest web specs look. And we've gone to the working group, the people that Mike West, for instance, who runs sort of the working group for browser standards. And we've actually had to go back and ask okay, this is our understanding of the web standards as they exist today in browsers and how they're implemented. Is this accurate? And then we have to go back to the developers and we'll say, okay, early on in the design lifecycle, maybe we iframe this, we use a cross-site post message to set a cookie, which can be done. Again, didn't realize until we asked. And yeah. And just how, what's the best way to use, we'll say post message to go back and forth. And these are architecture design decisions that you're trying to stave off and lessen the impact of something like XSS or whatever it may be, right? Well, when you try and do that later, what we found is the architecture is so drastically different from the way you would have recommended it be built, and using the latest web, and it's not using the latest security web standards to sort of like prevent these issues and lessen their impact, that like it's almost like we would have to redo so much in these applications if we came in later, that I don't know, it would be a whole other development effort altogether. It would be like a rewrite version 2, and it's just the money and the time sink. And then at that point too, then you've got other specifications or other issues that are not technical in nature, like your organization's like, hey, this thing's already out the door and it's working and people are using it. You're just gonna have to work within what hours we can dedicate to security. So it's such a bad thing for you to try and go back and do that later. It's not possible. It's just so hard. And those are just a few reasons why. That's what I was trying to add to that.
Yeah. Well, and then at that point, the business is now stuck accepting a level of risk they may never have wanted to accept. In the
risk accept everything.
I mean, and that's an interesting thing, because especially from a security perspective, I mean, if we try and translate our efforts into the business side, the earlier we help with things, the better return on the investment there is, right? So there's less of a cost. Because then we've had this, and this is a pet peeve of mine, and I've been trying to figure out how to solve it, but I have not had the capacity to, is we haven't really done a study since NIST did in 2001 about the actual costs of software defects at different stages in a life cycle. And that was absolutely done on the waterfall life cycle. I'd be really curious to see how that's changed in 2020, 2021, whenever we can get one. But those studies are like ridiculously expensive and long running to be able to actually get real legitimate data for. But so we know just inherently from working in this industry that the longer it takes you to find a problem, the more expensive it costs, because the farther back you have to go to try and address it. So a design flaw is way more expensive to eventually fix than an implementation bug. Where if you've just simply transposed a couple lines of code that's created a logical flaw and a vulnerability, that's a whole lot, relatively speaking, it's a whole lot cheaper and simpler to fix than if you designed the app in a way that, like, there's no way you can attach controls to it later. And so it's interesting to where the earlier we can get something like threat modeling to influence the design, the much more potential cost savings you have in the future. But again, it's really tough to strike that balance.
Yeah,
it is. And like, I can tell you that there's a lot more friction if you try to go back later, and not like, it's not because anybody's like doing it in bad faith. It's just like, literally it's hard and expensive, and like, what can you do? You can just try and shim in. Like, I've got this app that I hate this app. It's been around for like 2 years. I've been trying to get it murdered, and it still gets added to. And it's just a good example of like an app that didn't use a paved path. It didn't really like go through us. It just kind of came online. And that's, I mean, it came through us eventually, but not early on enough. So there's some issues with it. And it's just like, man, if I could just burn that thing down, my life would be so much better. I got a bug bounty about it today. So, it's just like one of those things that you do really have to like try and focus on getting that done early. I think I'm experiencing the pain of not doing that. So currently,
the thing I just linked to is DoD's attempt to fix these processes. DoD now has this Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, CMMC. We've had a few customers ask if Brian and I can actually run these sorts of assessments for them. So we're seeing this sort of thing flow in, and in fact, outside of government, these are not like, we don't deal with government organizations very frequently. So this is one of the better standards, or one of the newer standards, I should say, for trying to assess and cut off some of those inefficiencies that we see, and bring them earlier in the cycle, move them left of boom, like shift left, all those like fancy things that people like to say, But CMMC is like DoD's attempt to fix this sort of thing, and there are processes and whatnot in place that people are trying to do here. I linked to their like public briefing about the whole thing, but like this is a serious thing in government, obviously. But these are things that we're seeing private organizations struggling with, and they come to us and they're like, "Look, we need something. This is a thing that exists. Do you think you can help us with this?" So we see it frequently, quite frequently. And CMMC is super interesting as well. There is some good stuff in there. So.
Yeah. I was reading the briefing real quick. It's pretty much, it just seems like it's pretty much trying to explain like, here's our, here's why we're recommending this framework and here's what it's supposed to address. It's not like for anybody that reads that link, it's not a super lengthy presentation. It's like 15 slides. It's interesting. I think they cover a lot of the things we talk about, like configuration management, asset management, awareness and training situation. It's all, and you know, again, you guys mentioned holistic. This seems like it's a attempt at having sort of a holistic approach to this effort.
The other interesting side is the Navy actually has COOLS, and COOLS actually is fascinating to me because it has nothing to do with processes or whatnot. It's actually the people that you should hire at certain maturity levels, which is a fascinating concept to me because it's like that's something that we've literally been talking about, like who runs all of this stuff all of the time. And the Navy actually has a framework that like you can go through and be like, oh, I'm at this level, I need to hire someone who does incident response or whatever it is there. So it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, like again, Seth and I have talked about this in the source code or secure code review course, where it's like people are asking us questions, and we get to that point too, where we're like, wait a second, what all are you doing? Like, why are you so focused on AppSec? You know, like, wait, so what all are your AppSec teams doing? Like, how many things? And like, where? So do you have CERT? Do you have SecOps? Do you have stuff like that? It's like people want to hire, like, say, an AppSec person because they're like, we build a website and that's our main revenue. And then, but they forget, like, you know what, there's developer laptops and sales laptops and little iPads that you got to keep track of. And, you know, there's basic security hygiene you have to have. And like, you have to have key cards to get into your office. And so you need physical. And it's like, it's just like, that was the thing they thought they needed the most. And it's like, man, you're missing some pretty like basic security hygiene.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like knowing your needs, profiling your business accurately is like the lesson there.
That's at a higher pay grade than most of us are at, right? Like that's supposed to be CISO or whatever level. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, though. What?
I do see this stuff, so it's on my budget.
Yeah.
Well, you two are kind of, and even, you know, Brian was at one point too. I mean, you're basically outsourced CISOs at times. You really are, right? Because people are asking you, maybe they don't have a full time, and they like ask you to come in. And again, it's like that. We don't really know what we need, and I'm sure they call you in and they're like, "Tell us what we need. Tell us what advice." I mean, you're a consultant, so you kind of do play that role.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep. And the first question is always, what do you have? And they say, we don't know. And you're like,
oh, good.
Oh, good. This is going to be fun. Yeah.
Wait.
Well, and we have a website. Oh, good. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. They're like, we'll get you your access to our GitHub or whatever. Yeah.
You need root, AWS root account, right? Yeah. Yep. Nope. You're right.
One of my favorite examples of that is Brian and I were on an assessment at the company we all worked at before. And a client gave us a list of networks that they own. And through OSINT and other things, we found like almost 3 times as many networks as they, like, I'm not talking about hosts, I'm talking about networks. Like they just owned all
subnet.
They had no idea. They were like, oh, it's not an asset management. It's not anything that we like understood. Like, oh, good catch. And I'm like, what do you mean you're paying? Like someone pays for this every year. Like, you know, these are direct IP allocations. Like, you must know this stuff. And we're like, you know, now we got to secure it. You know?
Well, and
man, security at like those large organizations feels so daunting.
Oh, yeah.
It's major. But I mean, like looping back on a maturity model, which I've played with Sam, and then CMMC and looking at stuff like that. And then you look at for threat modeling. So I've been trying to help somebody figure out how to have a maturity model in architecture, or in threat modeling. But if you really come down to it, I think part of the reason why it's so hard is how do you define a good design? Completely separate from security, how would you define a good application design? There's no simple answer to it.
Yeah.
What
you'll know it when you see it. Yeah, I don't know. Yep.
What are you trying to get it to be able to do? How do you know something is a good design? I mean, I've got books on it, and they still dance around.
Yeah. I mean, concrete semantics, certified programming with dependent types. I have whole academic texts by very smart people on figuring these things out.
Because it is there's pros and cons to every design decision you make, and this is completely separate from security. So trying to in the general idea of an application architect with no knowledge of security, what is a good design is still an incredibly difficult problem to answer. And when we just mess it up with security.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Then, we step in and basically, screw it up. So they have to redesign around what we've chosen as our good security. And again, it goes back to what's good security design, right? On top of that.
Look at Intel's processor design.
Yeah.
It was a good design for performance. The read ahead and the caching and all the stuff that the security people have now gone and poked massive holes in.
Yep.
What was, one way that you could have designed to improve performance, and it's what they had picked. But at a holistic perspective, they made some trade-offs that came to light later. And it may be that I have no idea if they had any inkling that you could do something like this. And they're like, I hope nobody notices, because I've been part of those discussions with apps and app architecture. They're like, well, let's just hope nobody realizes that we actually gave you the capability of doing this. But it's a pile of trade-offs.
Yeah. I mean, everything is nowadays, right? And I don't know, we've been talking for quite a while, surprisingly enough, right?
As always.
And we haven't solved anything. You guys, you were supposed to solve threat modeling for me, and now
that wasn't on the agenda.
I mean, I can.
I put it on there.
I can solve it. You have to write full specifications in whatever spec language that you want. You have to have a full design requirements. Developers need to be empowered, but also abstracted from security domains such that they don't actually have to worry about CSP and those sorts of things. I mean, we can solve all these things. It's just no one wants to actually pay for solving those things.
Yes,
it's very expensive.
Yeah, it's solvable.
It's totally tractable. This isn't an intractable problem. It's just it's very expensive,
Which is why the government agencies are able to do it, right?
I mean, honestly, it has to mature to the point where it's less art, more science.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And we're not there yet, right?
No, and we're not. And app development's an interesting animal. I mean, look at the number of new languages, much less frameworks, much less anything that we tend to generate every year, because for whatever reason, somebody decided that they wanted make a better version of something, but start all over, not focus on a certain core set of core technologies and then improve them. We've decided that we're just going to start over and over and over and over. And you wonder why we can't secure anything.
I have 45 languages that I've designed, and I think 4 or 5 of them are in production. So I have no idea what you're talking about, Brian.
Yeah. And you're working on a 46th. It's going to solve all those problems.
Yeah,
naturally.
It'll be the new standard.
Yep.
I mean, security was hard 15 years ago when the primary languages in an enterprise was Java and .NET.
And Java has JML. Java has great tools for it. And no one and they're ancient. It's one of the most studied languages, and we have solutions for all of these things, and yet no one uses them.
It's because Java's the worst, right? Or whatever, right?
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. these are all tractable problems, but no, like it's just time and money. No one wants to put it in, like put in the effort.
I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I think it has more to do with the organizations that make those language choices. But there seems to be a certain type of organization structure and culture that gravitates towards certain frameworks like .NET and Java and Scala.
What's wrong with Scala?
How much time do we have? Yeah.
Well, I mean,
or they go towards what we call lovingly hipster frameworks, and there's a very big deviation between the two cultures.
Yeah.
But that's probably a topic for another day. Just like
we should talk.
That would be
talk on languages.
That'd be hilarious to just go through like the Stack Overflow language annual language survey report thing and just talk about them, because I've had I had a vendor come to me. They're like, we don't see a ton of Python in production. I'm like, I hope not.
Yeah,
it's not something you want to build very large production apps on.
Yeah,
I mean, it works great for a lot of things, but that's not one of them.
Yeah. No, there's certain things it works great for, and I guess maybe that's what it comes down to, is those choices are made. But I don't like my God, I don't want to go down the path. I don't want to go down that because we're going to be out here for another hour.
We should have a whole episode just about languages.
Oh golly, I wish we could choose languages based on the pros and cons of the language, but we all know we choose languages because whoever is in charge of choosing the language felt comfortable with one or another.
And I obviously have very extremist views on this, being a person with like a programming language theory background. But I also think very frequently it's because we don't have tooling and good understanding of languages either. There's no real reason to have to stick to any one language per se, but we just don't have very good tools for reasoning about things. Even though Poplog was in the 70s and OpenVMS had solutions to this from the beginning. But we haven't taken those ideas further. But I'll leave my extremism for another time.
Yeah, I think we're going to need to do a follow-up episode on, we ruin all the languages everywhere.
Well, this is why.
Yeah.
Yes.
What?
That's why I wanted Stefan to do that keynote.
Yeah, exactly.
So sign up for Midsummer Night's Con as soon as it's available, so you can hear about.
We have a sign up page. Sign up for it.
As soon as we have a sign up page, it'll watch this space, right? It's coming.
No, it'll cost you $0 to attend the conference.
Yeah, we will. We should have that out today. We should also have the author information sign up out today as well. So
dope, sweet.
But yeah, there's a lot to talk about with languages and design and that sort of stuff as well. And I don't want to say that it's Sapir-Whorf, right? Like the notion that your language limits the ideas that you're able to express, but there's certainly a level of elegance for star double dagger that you can express in languages there, and that cascades through the design. We can talk about Scala and whatnot, but there's definitely design choices in the language that cascade up that we see over and over again. You see it in Go. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff in Go that Bobby Tonic, we did a talk at GitHub on Go security, and like those semantics cascade up into application level issues continuously. So,
Well, and that's another thing that we're not terribly good at that I wish we were better at is language specific security.
Oh yeah.
I think OWASP tried with their language specific and framework specific cheat sheets. I think OWASP tried, but it's volunteer. It's up to, like, I know that I contributed to a Ruby or Rails one a long time ago, and man, I haven't been hit up since to like have updates to that thing. This must have been 7 years ago or something like that.
Everything.
What's that?
Is SAPI for everything. Like that's for a while there, they were pushing like, is SAPI for Java? Is SAPI for .NET? Is SAPI for JavaScript? Is SAPI for PHP? And then you'd use one, you'd look at the cheat sheet and it'd be like, oh, is SAPI for PHP? And you'd use it and it'd be like, they'd have a list of things that they haven't fixed yet, and like half the things you need are broken, and like CSRF is like, oh, actually install this thing, and yeah, it's volunteer. It's difficult,
Yeah,
that is.
Yep.
So,
I gotta get going, gents. Hate to say it.
Yeah.
I do as well.
Well, hey guys, we appreciate it. We'll do a follow up at some point. We'll do Midsummer Night's Con, and yeah, I mean, I know we didn't solve anything, but I really didn't expect us to. I'll be honest. This has been super informative, and hopefully the people listening as well. Yeah. Any final thoughts before we call it for today?
I'm glad to see you be nihilistic about future prospects. It warms my black little nihilist heart that you're admitting that.
I'm gonna go crawl up in a ball for about a half hour and then get back to work.
Exactly. No, I mean, it's like a full world of potentiality out there, but it's contextual. It's not objective. It's a subjective thing, and I can insert all sorts of continental philosophy terms in here, but it's that. I don't know, Brian. You probably have a different view.
Well, I mean, you knew what I was playing with when I was playing at Microsoft. When I was working for TWC, I was trying to figure out how to actually make threat modeling accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to play with, okay, so if we took the two things that we are best at for communicating as humans, and that is telling a story and drawing diagrams, can we open that up to people just in general? Is there a way to do it that's not like this? Because there's some tools and there's a lot of drop down boxes and things, and humans suck at providing information into web forms. We just are. We're terrible at it. It doesn't strike our creativity, and we don't divulge any information that way. But you go ask a person, tell me why you're proud of your application. Tell me your story about your app. They will tell you all sorts of things under the sun, because that engages the creativity process in them, and they want to share with you what they're very proud of doing or not proud of doing that they hope somebody fixes at some point. So I was playing with the idea of trying to, between natural language processing and HoloLens, trying to do virtual threat modeling, which is still something on my back burner that I still think about. And then I want to integrate it with FAIR, which is that framework for doing some level of risk assessment between security and try and put it in business terms. And I still have all the stuff from that, and I still want to chase it one day. But it is a difficult problem that we obviously have not found answers to, judging by where we are in the industry with it.
Yep.
And so it's not something like, oh yeah, if 4 people would just take 3 months, we could totally solve this. It's nowhere near that class of problem.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, it's not going to solve anytime soon, right? Like, it's more for right now, contextual, like Stefan's saying, like, you got to solve it for the place that you're at, the org that you're in, the problem that you're trying to solve, and then, hopefully at some point we'll be able to do the greater, threat modeling panacea, I guess, at some point.
Oh, I always theorized if you could get threat modeling to the point where you could actually have threat model diagrams that were consistent through application inventory, so you had consistent naming, you knew who talked to who on one hops, all of a sudden it would be consumed by business impact analysis and on all of the other disciplines, because all of a sudden they'd have some legitimate system that would tell you how everything interacted with each other.
Yeah.
Which is like a holy grail that we don't have anymore. We don't have at this point either.
Nope. Well, yeah, it all goes back to asset inventory at some point, right? Like how communication happens. Yeah, we'll get there, I guess, maybe. Or not, and we'll just continue to put a Band-Aid over it like we're currently doing. Well, good. Yeah, so catch us online. We'll post this within the next few hours on all the different podcast platforms. Ken, anything last minute before we wrap up for today?
Kenny.
Nope. Thank you for your time. Kenny, Ken, Dirtbag, Ginger, whatever you want to call me.
He responds to lots of names.
Commander Johnson.
Okay. All right. Well, Stefan,
nice.
Brian, appreciate it. Yeah. And we'll catch you guys online. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining today. Thanks for the discussion. It's been super interesting.
Sounds great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.